It was late afternoon when the rain swept in gray and steady over East Boston, and inside a high-end bakery called Auberge Dorée, a 28-year-old woman named Delphine Hale was on her feet near closing time, hauling crates and scrubbing trays, while her co-workers chatted with well-dressed customers up front. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a knot that had slipped loose an hour ago. Her gray eyes were rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep can't cure. And beneath her apron, she was thinner than a woman her age ought to be, because for 2 long years, she'd been giving the better half of every meal to her 5-year-old daughter and telling the little girl with a smile that she simply wasn't hungry. Delphine always drew the jobs nobody else would touch, because her manager, Camille, had a habit of pocketing the tips Delphine earned and handing her the hardest work in the shop, and Delphine never talked back, because a single mother buried under her ex-husband's gambling debts can't afford to lose the one paycheck standing between her child and the cold. So when the front door swung open against the downpour, and a soaked old woman, in a threadbare coat and cracked shoes, stepped inside asking only for a place to sit out of the rain, Delphine was the one person in that gleaming shop who didn't turn away in disgust. The others wrinkled their noses and told the stranger this wasn't a place for her kind, and Camille laughed and said the shelter was 3 blocks down the street. But Delphine quietly warmed a cup of cocoa, wrapped the last loaf of the day in paper she paid for, out of her own thin wallet, and set it before the trembling old woman with a gentle word and a chair. What Delphine couldn't possibly have known, as her manager fired her right there on the spot for giving away food and dragging the shop's image through the mud, was that the shivering stranger she'd just shown mercy to wasn't a beggar at all, but the mother of the most feared and powerful crime boss on the entire East Coast, a man named Sullivan Castellano, whose gaze was as cold as harbor water and whose name alone could silence a crowded room, and that one small cup of cocoa on a rainy afternoon was about to pull Delphine out of her own world and drop her, ready or not, straight into his. If a story about kindness colliding with a world that never saw it coming is the kind of story you love, do us one small favor and tap that like button right now. Share this video with someone who still believes good people deserve good endings, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's head back to that rainy Boston afternoon and find out exactly what Delphine's small act of mercy set in motion. The glass door closed behind Delphine with a cold click, and just like that, the 2 years she had spent bowing her head and enduring inside that bakery vanished in a matter of minutes, swept away with the afternoon rain pouring over the gray stone sidewalk. She pulled the collar of her thin coat up to cover the back of her neck, hugged the cardboard box holding her few small belongings tightly against her chest, her old shoes already soaked through, and walked away without daring to look back, because if she looked back she was afraid she would start crying right there in the street. Inside the bakery, beyond the glass fogged with steam, the old woman still sat quietly in the chair. Delphine had just pulled out for her, her thin hands wrapped around the cup of chocolate that was still warm, and she watched the young woman's figure disappear into the rain, with a look no one in the shop could understand, a look both gentle and far away, as if she were seeing something very old return inside a face very new. Camille stood behind the counter with her arms crossed, her lips curving in triumph, while the employees whispered to one another that the girl would never get anywhere anyway. But the old woman paid no attention to any of those words. She slowly drank the last sip of chocolate, set the cup down with careful neatness, then rose with the strange leisure of someone in no hurry. Before stepping out, she let her wrinkled hand linger for a moment on the polished wooden counter. The old woman stepped outside, opened a simple black umbrella, and vanished among the crowd, leaving behind a bakery where no one understood that it had just lost the most precious thing it had ever had. What no one in the shop realized, however, was that earlier, while Delphine was gently adjusting the warm shawl around the shivering stranger's shoulders, the old woman had quietly slipped a silver button, a unique token her family used to mark a debt of honor, into the young woman's apron pocket as a silent promise of gratitude. When Delphine was fired minutes later, she had hurriedly shoved her apron into her cardboard box without checking it, completely unaware of what she carried. For now, Delphine had only one place to return to. She walked nearly 4 blocks through the rain, and by the time she finally stepped down into her tiny basement apartment, her clothes were soaked through. The room was cold, But to Delphine, what made this place a home was her 5-year-old daughter Posy, sleeping deeply. One small hand of the child loosely held a worn linen handkerchief, embroidered with blue forget-me-nots. Wrapped safely inside that very handkerchief was a dark, aged silver button bearing a hawk crest, the last keepsake left from Delphine's late mother, who had guarded it her entire life as a sacred memory, telling Delphine it was a promise from someone she had once saved long ago. Delphine gently placed the handkerchief and the heirloom beside her daughter's pillow, like a silent goodnight blessing. Delphine stood motionless at the threshold for a long while, letting rainwater drip steadily onto the floor, only to watch her child sleep. And in that moment, all the humiliation of an afternoon spent being trampled on and fired slowly settled, giving way to another fear, quieter but far heavier. Because on the small table by the door still lay Posy's prescription and the reminder slip for her follow-up appointment. The little girl carried inside her chest a weak lung that always struggled whenever the weather changed, and the reserve medicine in the apartment would last only about 10 more days. Delphine quietly took off her wet coat, hung it on the nail behind the door, then sat down on the edge of the bed, reached out to stroke her daughter's hair, and forced back the sigh rising inside her chest, so she would not wake that peaceful dream. She counted in her mind every coin left in her thin wallet, the money that should have been there if Camille had not stolen her entire week's tips, and she realized with a chilling clarity that she had just lost her only job at the very moment her daughter needed it most. She told herself that tomorrow she would look for another job, any job, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, working nights, anything as long as there was money to buy medicine for her child. And she was certain that the days ahead would be only another familiar chain of hardship, the kind a poor mother like her had already tasted far too many times. But Delphine could not possibly know, as she sat there in that dark, cold basement, that the loaf of bread she had just given away, and the cup of chocolate she had just poured from her own meager money had quietly set in motion a chain of events that even her boldest imagination would never have dared to dream of, and that in only a few short days, a glossy black car would stop in front of those damp stairs, carrying with it an invitation that would divide her life forever into before and after. The simple black umbrella, fold shut, on the stone steps of a mansion hidden behind old oak trees at the northern edge of the city. A house no one passing on the street could have guessed the contents of, because its quiet exterior had been designed precisely so no one would want to look at it for long. The old woman passed through the heavy iron gate that opened without a sound, and the moment it closed behind her, the stooped gate from earlier seemed to vanish. Her shoulders straightened, her steps became firm, and the woman who had just sat trembling inside a strange bakery now crossed the grand hall with the calm of someone who knew very well that everything beneath this roof belonged to her. A maid hurried forward to take the frayed coat and cracked shoes from her, as if they were props whose role had ended, brought her a warm silk shawl and a cup of hot tea, while she, Rosalind Castellano, only nodded softly in thanks before walking unhurriedly toward the study where her son was waiting. Inside the room, behind an enormous dark wooden desk, a man stood with his back to the door, looking through the tall window at the rain-soaked garden below, his hands clasped behind him, his frame tall and steady as a stone pillar, and when he slowly turned around, his cold face came fully into view, with gray-blue eyes sharp as cooled steel, neatly brushed black hair touched with silver at both temples, and a faint scar running along the left side of his jaw like the trace of a past no one dared ask about. Sullivan Castellano was not the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to make others fall silent, because the moment he entered a room, every sound died on its own, and the entire East Coast understood that behind that almost indifferent quiet was a power capable of moving mountains with a single nod. But when those cold eyes touched his mother, something in them softened, only for an instant, just enough for anyone to know that this woman was the only soft place left in him. He poured her another cup of tea and asked in a low voice how the trip had been, and Rosalind, instead of answering at once, only sat down in her familiar armchair, cradled the teacup in both hands as if still searching for warmth, and began to tell him. She told him about the rain, about the shining bakery with its pretty name, about the faces that wrinkled in disgust when she walked in, about the manager who laughed and told her to find the poorhouse 3 blocks away, and her voice remained even, without a trace of resentment as she recounted it all, because none of that was strange to her. She had worn that disguise many times in her life and had grown used to the way people revealed who they truly were when they believed they were standing before someone who had nothing to offer them. But then her voice changed, softened and warmed, when she spoke of a young woman, the only person in the shop who had not turned away, the one who had quietly warmed a cup of hot chocolate and used her own money to buy the last loaf of the day for her, the one who had pulled out a chair for her and spoken to her in a voice so gentle that she almost forgot she was playing the role of a beggar. Sullivan listened without interrupting, but when his mother reached the part where that woman had been fired on the spot, simply because she had been kind to her, his fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden desk, his knuckles turning white, and when he spoke, his voice was so low and cold that the very air in the room seemed to freeze as he asked the name of that bakery. Rosalind said the name, and he closed his eyes for a moment because he knew it well. The shop stood among the properties his family had funded and protected for years, which meant the people who had just humiliated his mother and thrown her out were working on ground, sheltered by his own hand. And nothing in the world enraged Sullivan Castellano more than betrayal happening beneath a shadow he believed was safe. He was about to call his people at once, but his mother's wrinkled hand settled over his, stopping him with a light squeeze, and she told him to wait. That punishment could come later, because what concerned her now was not the people who had laughed at her, but the girl who had given her a seat in the rain. Just then, a man around 40 entered the room with several stacks of documents in his hands. Rourke Castellano, a distant relative of the family whom Sullivan trusted with the accounts and private appointments, his face composed and his courteous smile always in place. And he bowed softly to his aunt before quietly setting the files on the desk, lingering just long enough to overhear fragments of the story before withdrawing. When the door closed behind Rourke, Rosalind looked distantly out at the rain-soaked garden, her fingers unconsciously searching her coat as she thought of the token she had just given to the kind girl. She said softly, almost to herself, that there are debts a person carries for an entire lifetime, referencing the original crest button she had given to a nameless savior decades ago and spent years trying to track down. She murmured that sometimes fate is kind enough to cross our paths with pure hearts when we least expect it. Sullivan looked up at his mother, briefly confused by the deep sorrow in her voice, and asked what lifelong debt she was talking about, but Rosalind only smiled and shook her head, telling him there were things she would explain only when the time was right. For the moment, there was only one thing he needed to do, and that was to find the woman named Delphine. Finding a woman when all they knew was a shortened name, and the place that had just fired her should have seemed simple for a man with power like Sullivan. But, from the very beginning, it ran into strange obstacles that only made him more irritated. Rosalind could only remember that people called her Del, that she was young, with a kind face and gray eyes touched by a sadness she tried to hide, but she did not know her full name, did not know where she lived, and had not had time to ask a single question before the girl was thrown out the door, and the only thing she knew for certain was that the girl had worked at the bakery called Auberge Dorée. Sullivan summoned Isaac Poole, the trusted assistant who had served him for many years, a calm man with eyes that were always watching and a cool head that had never allowed emotion to govern him, and he gave Isaac the task of finding that woman no matter what, but added a sentence Isaac rarely heard from him, that he should do it in a way that would not frighten her. The problem arose the moment Isaac contacted the bakery, because when he had people quietly ask about an employee named Del who had just left, the names in the payroll records did not match, and only later did it become clear that Camille, immediately after firing Delphine, had quietly erased her from the work schedule, and crossed her off the timesheet, as if trying to destroy every trace of having mistreated someone who might cause trouble later. That petty dishonesty nearly broke the trail, if not for Isaac being meticulous down to the smallest detail. He had the entire sales record from that rainy afternoon reviewed, and among the transactions from elegant customers, he found one unusually small payment, an end-of-day loaf of bread purchased with an employee's personal card, and the name on that transaction appeared clearly, Delphine Hale. From that full name, everything slowly began to be traced. An address in the basement district on the east side of the city, a brief and sorrowful file belonging to a struggling single mother, and Isaac quietly brought it all back and placed it on Sullivan's desk without a word of comment, because he knew his master disliked unnecessary words. What Isaac did not say, and what few people in that bakery could have guessed, was that Auberge Doré had long been under the ownership of the Castellano family, though through so many layers of overlapping shell companies that even Camille only knew she was being paid by some distant investment group, with no idea who the real man behind the entire row of properties was, and no ability to imagine that the ragged old woman she had just insulted was his mother. That distance had been built deliberately, because Sullivan had always wanted to keep himself removed from the pieces of business considered clean, and that very distance, ironically, had allowed the people beneath him to behave cruelly, without the slightest fear, until that fateful afternoon. When Isaac finished presenting the information and prepared to withdraw, Sullivan picked up the file, and his eyes lingered on the line bearing the bakery's name longer than necessary, long enough that Isaac, who was used to reading the smallest changes on his master's expressionless face, had to glance up slightly to observe him. Something passed through those gray-blue eyes, not the anger still smoldering from the matter of his mother being insulted, but something else, deeper and older, as if the name Auberge Doré had lightly touched a memory buried somewhere inside him, something even he was not yet willing to name. He set the file down slowly, looked out at the garden now clear of rain, where drops of water still glimmered on the oak branches, and softly asked Isaac which street corner the bakery stood on. A strange question, because he should not have needed to know that much, and when Isaac answered he only gave a very small nod, his lips pressing together as if hiding something even his most trusted man was not allowed to know. Isaac asked no more, because he understood his boundary, and he only quietly noted in his mind that this time, behind the usual cold command, there was something deeply personal making his master different. Just then, Rourke entered the room again with a stack of ledgers needing Sullivan's approval, placed them on the desk with his usual courteous smile, glanced at the file lying open before Sullivan and the name Delphine Hale printed clearly on it, then politely asked whether there was any paperwork he might help with, since he was the one who oversaw the family's discreet expenditures. Sullivan answered only that it was not needed yet, and Rourke nodded and withdrew with his familiar composure, no one in the room noticing that his eyes had already memorized every line of the file before the door closed, and no one suspecting that a name just found through kindness was about to become a name examined through calculation. As for Sullivan, after everyone had gone out, he remained sitting alone for a very long time in the dim afternoon room, the file in his hand, his eyes resting on the name of the bakery, and for the first time in many years, the man whose name made an entire region hold its breath felt his heart sink beneath the weight of something he had thought had fallen asleep long ago. That night, when the rain outside had softened into a fine mist and a thread of cold slipped through the cracks of the basement door, Delphine was awakened not by a sound, but by an unnatural silence, the vague instinct of a mother who always slept with half her heart awake to guard her child. She sat up sharply and heard it. Posy's breathing was no longer steady and peaceful, as it had been earlier that night, but strained, each inhale followed by a small wheeze, as if that tiny chest had to work harder than usual. Delphine hurriedly knelt beside the bed, placed her hand on her daughter's back, and felt each quick breath. The little girl opened her still sleepy eyes and looked at her mother, not crying, only lightly clutching at her sleeve, and that patient, obedient endurance in her child tightened Delphine's heart more than any sob could have done. She reached for the backup inhaler on the small table, helped her daughter use it exactly as the doctor had instructed, then gathered her into her arms, propping Posy's back against her chest so she could breathe more easily, soothing her while whispering gentle reassurances that Mommy was here. Mommy was right here. Breathe slowly with me, sweetheart. Posy's breathing eased for a little while, but then grew heavy again, and Delphine understood that this time the familiar inhaler was not enough. Her child needed to be taken to the hospital, needed doctors, needed things Delphine knew she would soon have to pay for, with money she did not have in her pocket. She glanced at the thin wallet lying on the table, the little money left inside nowhere near enough for a night in emergency care, and in that unsteady moment, her eyes stopped on her own finger, where the worn gold wedding ring still remained, the last possession she had never had the heart to sell, even through the hungriest months, because it was no longer the keepsake of a marriage that had fallen apart, but the only thing reminding her that there had once been a time when she believed in a home. But when she looked down at her daughter's face, struggling for breath in her arms, Delphine did not hesitate for even 1 second. She slipped the ring off, held it tightly in her palm, and understood that no keepsake in the world was worth as much as one easy breath from her child. She wrapped Posy warmly in the blanket, lifted her into her arms, and before leaving home, she managed to reach for the linen handkerchief, embroidered with her mother's little blue forget-me-not flowers, tucking it into her coat pocket, as if carrying a silent prayer with her. Thanks to a pawn shop open late on the corner and a kind taxi driver willing to wait, Delphine managed to bring her daughter to the emergency room of a nearby hospital, where the doctors quickly took Posy in and began caring for her with treatments that helped her breathe more easily again. Delphine stood outside the glass window, her hands clasped tightly together, her lips moving around wordless prayers, and every minute that passed felt to her as long as an entire winter, until a nurse stepped out with a reassuring smile and said the little girl was much better, that the breathing attack had been brought under control, and that Posy only needed to rest and be observed for a few more hours before they could feel safe. Hearing that, Delphine's legs nearly gave way from relief, and she had to grip the wall to keep herself standing, while the tears she had held back all night finally rolled silently down her face, no longer tears of despair, but of gratitude too deep for words. When she was allowed in beside her daughter, she saw Posy already drifting into peaceful sleep on the white hospital bed, color returning to her face, her breathing light and even like a kite that had found the wind again. And Delphine pulled the chair closer, sat down beside her, and held that tiny hand in her own. She took her mother's handkerchief from her coat pocket, folded it gently, and pressed it to her child's cool forehead, as she had done on so many nights, whispering that Grandma was watching over you, my darling. You're going to be healthy, and there's nothing to be afraid of anymore. In the soft light of the hospital room, the young mother sat there through the night without leaving her child for half a step, and amid the drained exhaustion of her body, amid the emptiness on the finger that had just lost the last ring, Delphine still felt strangely at peace, because her child was safe, and to a mother, that was everything in this world worth trading for. She had no idea that even as she sat there quietly, keeping watch over her daughter's sleep somewhere else in the city, a man was holding her address in his hand and preparing to step into her life in a way she could never have foreseen, and that this longest night of her life would turn out to be the last night. She would have to carry everything alone. The next morning slipped into the hospital room, through the gap in the curtains, with the pale sunlight left behind after the rain, and Delphine, still sitting in the chair beside her daughter's bed, with dark circles under her eyes from a sleepless night, was softly singing an old lullaby to Posy when there came a gentle knock at the door. She lifted her head and saw a strange man standing at the threshold, tall and lean, dressed in a black suit tailored so precisely that every seam lay smooth, a leather briefcase in his hand, his face composed, and his eyes watchful in the manner of someone used to controlling every situation. And immediately the instinctive caution of a woman life had betrayed too many times made Delphine spring to her feet, placing herself between the stranger and her child's bed. The man did not step inside. He only gave a polite little bow and introduced himself as Isaac Poole. Then in a deep, even voice, he said a sentence that sent a chill down Delphine's spine. He called her Miss Delphine Hale, with both first and last name, the name she had not given to anyone in this hospital. The name that last night, in her rush to be admitted, she had not even had time to finish writing on the paperwork. She stepped back half a pace, her voice guarded as she asked who he was and how he knew her name, whether he was someone sent by a creditor to collect some debt left by her former husband. Because in her mind then only the darkest possibilities appeared. The people a poor indebted mother like her always feared would one day knock at the door. Isaac slowly shook his head, his voice still gentle and carrying no threat, and said that he had not come to ask anything of her. On the contrary, he had come on behalf of someone who wished to help her, and the entire cost of Posy's emergency care from the night before had already been paid. More than that, the person he represented wished to cover the little girl's entire long-term treatment, to bring her to the best specialists and make sure she would never go without medicine for even one more day. For another woman, those words might have been a life raft in the open sea. But for Delphine, who had learned through blood and tears that nothing in this world came free, that unbelievable generosity only frightened her more. She asked directly what they wanted from her in exchange, because people did not simply spend so much money on a stranger without demanding something, and she said in a trembling but stubborn voice that she was not the kind of woman who sold herself, no matter how poor she was, and she would not let her daughter grow up inside a trap whose bottom she could not yet see. Isaac listened quietly without taking offense. He even gave a small nod, as if he respected her caution, then said he understood why she was suspicious, and perhaps it would be better if she heard directly from the person who wanted to help her. He took out a phone, pressed a few keys, then turned the screen toward her, and the face that appeared there made Delphine freeze, because it was the old woman from the bakery, the woman to whom she had poured a cup of hot chocolate in the middle of that rainy afternoon. Only this time, she was no longer wearing the frayed coat, but sitting in a warm and elegant room, her silver hair neatly brushed, her kind face lit by a gentle smile. She called Delphine in the warm voice Delphine still remembered, saying, "Don't be afraid, my child. I am the old woman you were kind to that day, and I'm sorry I hid who I truly was from you, but I promise you that no one here means to harm you or the little girl. I only want to return a small part of the kindness you gave me, when you had no idea who I was." Hearing that voice, seeing that face, one part of Delphine wanted to believe, but the fear carved deep inside her still would not let go, and she choked out through the screen that she was deeply grateful for the hospital bill being paid for her child. But she could not accept more, that she was not used to being given anything for nothing, and she was afraid that if she accepted, then one day she would have to pay with her own daughter. On the other side of the screen, Rosalind only sighed softly, her eyes so gentle they seemed to understand every wound this young woman was carrying, and she said that Delphine did not need to decide anything in a hurry, my child, that she should focus first on helping the little girl fully recover, and everything else could wait. She only asked one thing, that Delphine not let pride make her refuse something that could keep the child safe. And in that quiet hospital room, Delphine stood still, one hand still holding the small hand of her sleeping daughter, her heart torn between the dignity that had carried her through an entire life of hardship and the motherhood that forced her to set every pride aside, while one question, still unanswered, kept burning quietly in her mind again and again, how the man in the black suit had known the full name she had never spoken to anyone. It took 3 more days before Posey was discharged from the hospital, and throughout those 3 days, though Delphine had not agreed to anything, she still saw her daughter cared for with such thoroughness that it left her both grateful and uneasy. Skilled doctors came by more often. Good medicines she had never dared dream of before appeared fully supplied on the table, and every time she tried to speak up and refuse, she would look down at the healthy color returning to her child's face, and the words would catch in her throat. At last, when Rosalind called and invited mother and daughter to come to her home for a few days of rest so the little girl could recover completely, her voice was so sincere that Delphine could no longer find any reason to refuse, and one morning, a glossy black car arrived to pick them up at the hospital entrance, Isaac courteously opening the door and helping her arrange their few small bags. The car rolled through streets that grew quieter and greener with every passing block, leaving far behind the damp basement district. Delphine still called home, and when it finally moved slowly through a tall iron gate that opened without a sound, Delphine held her child tightly in her arms, her eyes widening at the scene before her. The mansion stretched out like something from dreams she had never dared dream. Old oaks standing solemnly on both sides of the white gravel drive, a somber stone building with soaring windows, and inside were broad halls paved with gleaming marble that reflected the light of crystal chandeliers, paintings hanging on the walls that Delphine guessed each might be worth more than everything she could earn in a lifetime. She walked carefully, as if afraid of staining the space itself, her hand gripping her daughter's, the lost feeling of someone who knew very well she did not belong here rising in her chest, and just as she was becoming overwhelmed and confused, she looked up and saw him. At the far end of the grand hall stood a man, tall and solid in a dark gray suit, his sharp gray-blue eyes resting on her with such focused attention that the very air seemed to thicken, and though no one had introduced him, Delphine understood at once that he was the master of everything she was seeing, the man whose presence alone made her unconsciously hold her breath. Sullivan Castellano did not smile, nor did he offer any ornate greeting. He only inclined his head slightly and introduced himself in a low voice, and that voice was both so courteous it could not be faulted, and filled with a cold authority that made a person want to bow and step back at the same time. A danger wrapped in a perfect shell of elegance. Delphine stammered a reply, her hands still not leaving her child, and she felt pitifully small beneath that examining gaze, until Posy, tired from the long trip, gently tugged at her mother's coat and sank down onto the stone step, one tiny shoelace having come loose and trailed along the floor. And what Delphine did next happened so naturally that she herself was not even aware of it. She immediately dropped to one knee, right in the middle of that strange, magnificent hall, forgetting the frightening presence of the powerful man watching her, forgetting even the fear and displacement that had just filled her, focusing only on carefully tying her daughter's shoe, smoothing the hem of her child's trousers, softly asking whether she was very tired, placing her child first in her mind before herself in every way. From the staircase, Rosalind had just begun descending and saw the whole moment, and she stopped on the step, watching quietly with an expression of indescribable tenderness, then leaned toward the son standing nearby and said softly, just loud enough for him alone to hear, "Do you notice, in a place completely unfamiliar to her, and in front of a man who makes everyone wary, that girl still worries about the child before she even has time to worry about her own fear." Sullivan did not answer his mother, and he did not need to, because his eyes at that moment said everything for him. Those eyes, long accustomed to seeing people through the lens of calculation and suspicion, now rested on the image of the woman, kneeling to tie her daughter's shoe for far longer than necessary, so long that even he was briefly surprised by his own inability to look away. In a life spent meeting countless people who approached him with false smiles and hands held out in expectation, this was the first time he had seen someone seem to forget his presence entirely. And strangely, instead of feeling disregarded, he felt something rise within him that he could not name, something both new and unsettling, as if that small woman, without knowing it at all, had just lightly touched a door inside him that had been closed for a very long time. The first evening in the mansion passed for Delphine like a dream from which she was always afraid she would suddenly wake. Mother and daughter were given a spacious, warm room, with a bed softer than anything she had ever lain on. Posy was bathed in warm water, and given a dinner so complete that the little girl kept widening her eyes in wonder, then drifted off to sleep in a fullness and comfort that mother and child had not known for a very long time. Yet, in the middle of that unfamiliar warmth, Delphine felt a restlessness she could not name, because she understood that the greater a kindness was, the heavier the price often became later, and she had grown used to guarding herself against beautiful things that came too easily. The next morning, while Posy was still sleeping deeply, a maid came to invite her down to the study to meet the master of the house, and when Delphine stepped inside, she saw Sullivan seated behind the large wooden desk, several thick envelopes and a stack of papers in front of him, and beside them, on a small table, a black velvet box and a set of keys. He invited her to sit with his usual courteous gesture, then in a low, even voice with no unnecessary emotion. He said he had arranged a few things to express his gratitude for what she had done for his mother. He pushed the envelopes toward her and explained that they contained enough money for her to pay off every debt and live comfortably for a long time, that the keys belonged to a new car already waiting in the courtyard for her use, and that he had also arranged for every cost of Posy's medicine and treatment to be fully covered for 1 whole year, with nothing missing. For most people in this world, it would have been the moment when a lifetime of worry suddenly dissolved, but Delphine only sat in silence for a long while, looking at those gifts, then lifted her eyes and gently pushed the envelopes and the keys back toward him. She said she was deeply grateful to him and to Mrs. Rosalind, that she had no words to fully express her appreciation for such generosity, but she could not accept that money, and she could not accept the car. Sullivan raised an eyebrow slightly, a rare expression on a face usually cold as stone, and asked why, his voice carrying no anger, only honest surprise, because in his entire life he had never met anyone who pushed his money back to him. Delphine took a breath and in a soft but steady voice She said that she had once had a life in which she allowed someone else to hold everything for her, allowed a man to decide her fate with his money, and she had lost everything because of it, lost both her peace and her self-respect, until it had taken her years to learn how to stand on her own feet again. She said that when people accepted a gift too large, they also handed away a piece of their freedom, and she had sworn to herself that she would never let herself become dependent on anyone again, no matter how difficult the nights of independence might become. Then she stopped, her eyes softening as she looked toward the stairs leading up to the room where her daughter was sleeping, and added that there was only one thing she would ask permission to accept, and that was help with Posey's medicine, not for herself, but because the child deserved to be healthy, and a mother like her was willing to set aside every bit of pride just to trade it for one easy breath from her daughter. Sullivan sat in silence for a long time after those words. He did not answer immediately, only looked at the woman sitting before him, with a gaze he himself did not realize had changed, because he had spent his whole life in a world where everything had a price, where human hearts could be bought, and loyalty was only an investment. A world that had taught him to believe that anyone who came near him wanted something. And yet this small woman, with calloused hands and worn old shoes, had just refused everything that countless others would have done anything to obtain, keeping only the one thing she needed for her child and not for herself. And that made something inside Sullivan falter, an old belief he had worn as armor for so many years suddenly cracking in one small place. At last he only nodded softly, took back the envelopes and the keys, and said in a low voice that he respected her decision, a brief sentence, yet for him a rare thing, because Sullivan Castellano was not used to respecting anyone's choices, and when Delphine bowed her head in thanks and quietly left the study, he remained seated there, watching her shadow disappear behind the door, his heart filling with a question for which, for the first time in his life, he had no ready answer. Where, in the world he had believed he understood completely, was he supposed to place a person like that? That night, alone in the study with a glass of wine he had not touched to his lips, Sullivan sat for a very long time before the burning fireplace, and in the flickering light, the memories he had tried to bury for so many years quietly rose again, as they always did on the nights when he could not sleep. He remembered the night he was only 12 years old, the night that had stolen from him every ability to trust anyone completely, when his father, a man he had once worshipped like an idol, was betrayed by the very men he called brothers, the men who had sat at the same table and laughed at the same jokes, turning their backs on him during a negotiation that should have been a place of safety. The boy Sullivan had hidden behind a crack in the door, and witnessed the moment his father realized the truth too late, witnessed the look in his father's eyes when he understood that the hands he had trusted most were the very hands pushing him down. And what haunted the boy for the rest of his life was not the chaos of that night, but his father's face when he was betrayed by his own people, a face filled with pain and loneliness to the very end. From that night on, the innocent boy died, and from his ashes rose someone else, a cold and watchful Sullivan, a man who built around himself a suit of armor made from suspicion, a man who believed every human heart had a price and every act of kindness concealed a calculation, because he would rather believe the worst than ever again taste the expression his father had worn on that final night. That was why, for all these years, not a single act of kindness had been allowed through his armor without being cut open and examined until he found the hidden motive, and that was also why the appearance of Delphine, the woman who had just pushed an entire fortune back to him simply to keep her dignity, had left him so restless. But what even Isaac did not know, what Sullivan had never spoken aloud to anyone, was that the name of the bakery, Auberge Dorée, had already meant something to him many months before the rainy night when his mother stepped inside it. Because on an early morning nearly half a year ago, one of his most trusted men, a man who had followed him from the days when he had nothing, and whom Sullivan regarded as a younger brother, had been badly wounded in a clash between underground forces and had collapsed on the sidewalk in front of that bakery before the sky was fully light. Passers-by had kept their distance, no one daring to stop for a wounded stranger, everyone except one person, a bakery employee who had come to open the shop early and had knelt beside him without hesitation, used her own scarf to stop the bleeding, called an ambulance, and stayed to keep him conscious until help arrived, then quietly left without giving her name, without asking questions, without demanding anything at all. That trusted man survived, and when he told Sullivan about his nameless savior, he remembered only that she was a girl who worked at Auberge Dorée, with sad gray eyes and strangely gentle hands. Sullivan, a man who did not believe in causeless kindness, had secretly sent people to look into that girl, and from then on, though he had never met her, he had quietly kept his eyes on that little bakery, as a mystery his reason could not explain, a rare exception in his sharply divided world of black and white. So when his mother returned and told him about the woman named Dell, who had been kind to her on the rainy evening, and when the name Delphine Fane Hale appeared on the file before him, Sullivan had gone still, because he recognized a coincidence he did not believe was chance, that the woman who had saved his trusted man that winter morning and the woman who had warmed his mother inside the bakery were one and the same, as if fate had twice placed the same kind soul at the most important moments of his life. The next morning, when he met Delphine again in the garden, where Posy was running and playing beneath the sun, Sullivan mentioned nothing about the past. He only told her in his low, even voice that he had another proposal, not a free gift but a real job. He said he owned a respectable restaurant that needed a kitchen manager with both heart and skill, that he had heard about her capable hands and her goodness, and that if she agreed, it would be work she could be proud of, a wage she earned through her own strength, rather than something received from anyone's pity. Delphine looked up at him, briefly stunned by an offer that fit her dignity so precisely she could not refuse it at once, and in the cold man's eyes, for the first time, she saw something almost warm, though she could not possibly know that this seemingly chance offer had in fact taken root on some winter morning, when she had knelt beside a stranger outside the bakery, without ever thinking of being repaid. Delphine did not hurry to agree to that offer, because during the days she lived beneath the Castellano roof, no matter how kindly she was treated, she gradually sensed that the world surrounding this man was not as simple as its quiet exterior suggested. She noticed the well-dressed men coming and going from the mansion with sealed expressions, the whispered conversations behind doors left half-closed, the way the servants bowed their heads when Sullivan passed by, not with ordinary respect, but with a wariness mixed with fear, and she had lived enough to understand that the immense power behind all this luxury could not possibly have been built entirely from clean sources. That was what made her heart struggle so fiercely, because on one side she was a mother who needed every possible chance to raise her child, and on the other she was a woman who had spent her whole life trying to keep her hands clean, no matter how poor she became, and she feared that accepting work from a man like Sullivan would also mean allowing part of the darkness of his world to slip into Posy's innocent life. She lay awake through many nights with that question, and each time she almost decided to refuse. The image of her daughter struggling for breath during that emergency night returned to her, reminding her that sometimes a mother did not have the right to remain perfectly clean, only the right to choose the road that would harm her child the least. That turmoil brought back the past she always tried to forget, brought back Grant, the former husband she had once loved with all the innocence of youth. A man with a warm smile, but an emptiness of gambling inside him that had no bottom. She remembered the years when she had tried to hold up a home that sank deeper into debt with each passing day. Remembered the way their last dollars quietly disappeared. And most of all remembered the day she discovered that Grant had secretly mortgaged even her mother's small house, the house her mother had spent an entire lifetime saving for, to get money for his bets, and then vanished without a word, leaving two women to bear the consequences of sins they had never committed. Her mother, the gentle woman who had worked tirelessly all her life, lost her home in her final years and had to move into a nursing facility, where she quietly withered from sorrow and failing health, and she passed away on an autumn afternoon when Delphine, because she had to work 3 shifts in a row to earn money, did not make it to her side in time for the last moment. That loss left in Delphine a wound that never fully healed, and a guilt that clung to her for years. The feeling that she should have been wiser, should have seen the truth earlier, should have been able to protect the mother she loved most, instead of letting her die alone because of the mistakes of a man she had trusted too easily. And from that pain, a habit formed inside her like a self-protective reflex that never turned off. She became someone who always kept every document, always copied every contract, always photographed and carefully stored every receipt, every signature, every seal, because she had learned at too high a cost that when people wanted to destroy the life of a trusting woman, they always began with papers she had not bothered to read closely. She would never again let herself be pushed into helplessness, because she lacked proof. And though that habit now seemed unnecessary in a life that had grown a little steadier, she still kept it the way people keep a scar to remember where they had once been hurt. In the end, after weighing everything, Delphine went to Sullivan and told him she agreed to take the kitchen manager position he had offered. But she added, in a calm and firm voice, that she had conditions of her own. She looked straight into his gray-blue eyes and said she would work with all her heart, but she would work only at the restaurant, in the honest and decent part of the business, while anything that belonged to his other world, the things she could sense but did not wish to name, she asked permission to stand outside of it, not hearing, not seeing, not becoming involved. She said she had a daughter, and she wanted to teach her child through her own life that a person could be poor, and still hold her head high. That clean money, even if little, was worth more than wealth bought at the cost of one's conscience. Sullivan silently listened as she set her boundaries, and instead of feeling offended or displeased the way he usually did with anyone who dared place conditions before him, he felt a strange respect rise inside him, because in all the world where everyone wanted to move deeper into the circle of his influence for gain, this was the first person who had deliberately drawn a line in order to keep herself outside. And he gave a slight nod, agreeing to everything she asked, while wondering how many more things about this woman would continue to shake the worldview he had believed to be unbreakable. The restaurant Sullivan placed under Delphine's kitchen management was elegant yet warm, located downtown, and within only a few short weeks, her skillful hands and devoted heart seemed to breathe new life into the entire kitchen. The staff under her came to love her for her fairness and kindness, while diners began returning more often because the food was cooked with something money could not buy. Delphine found in that work a joy and a pride she had not felt in a very long time, and for the first time in years, she felt she was standing firmly on her own feet, not leaning on anyone's pity. What she did not expect was that on late evenings, after the restaurant had closed and she stayed behind to clean the kitchen, Sullivan would occasionally stop by, at first with reasons like checking the accounts or discussing work, but gradually those reasons became so thin that both of them quietly understood he came simply because he wanted to come. In the soft yellow light of the late-night kitchen, the man whose name made an entire region hold its breath became someone else. He sat on the stool by the counter, removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, quietly watching Delphine work, sometimes asking about a dish, sometimes saying nothing at all, and in that silence there was a kind of peace he had not known for a very long time. One night, when Delphine poured him a cup of hot tea and set before him a slice of cake she had just baked as a test, Sullivan took the teacup and looked at it for a long time before speaking, his voice lower and softer than usual. He said that all his life, whenever someone was kind to him, he immediately wondered what they wanted from him, because experience had taught him that kindness was always a price paid in advance for something that would be demanded later. He lifted his eyes to her and said that with her, however, he had kept trying and failing to guess, that he had waited day after day to see her hold out her hand and ask for something like everyone else. And yet she still seemed to want nothing at all, and that, he admitted, unsettled him even more than an enemy, because he did not know how to guard himself against a person whose motive he could not find. Delphine stopped what she was doing and smiled softly at that strange confession, then answered gently that perhaps he had lived too long in a world where everything had to carry a price, so long that he had forgotten there were still things people did simply because they were the right thing to do, not in exchange for anything. That simple sentence left Sullivan silent for a long while, as if it had touched a place inside him no one had reached in far too long. The affection between them grew through those quiet late nights, not through ornate words but through shared silences, and what opened Sullivan's closed heart more than anything was Posy. The little girl, with the fearless innocence of childhood, had no idea how frightening that tall man was in the eyes of adults. She ran to him, tugged at his hand, demanded that he look at the pictures she had drawn, and Sullivan, who had never known how to behave around a child, awkwardly sat down beside her, clumsily taking the crayon she pushed into his hand. The little girl giggled and teased him for drawing such an ugly cat, then patiently took his hand and showed him how to draw it again. And in that moment, a rare smile appeared on the steel man's face. A smile so genuine that even he forgot how long it had been since he had smiled like that. Delphine watched the scene from a distance, her heart filling with warmth and confusion, because she realized this man was slowly becoming something she did not dare name in the lives of mother and daughter. But it was also during one of those late kitchen nights, in the middle of conversation, that Sullivan carelessly mentioned a detail that made Delphine stop still. He accidentally spoke of the way she used to open the bakery in the earliest hours of morning, a time only someone who had once watched her could have known, and when she asked in surprise how he knew that when they had only just met, Sullivan suddenly fell silent, a rare flicker of confusion passing through his eyes. Then he only deflected, saying perhaps his mother had told him, and quickly turned the conversation elsewhere. Delphine did not press him further, but inside her, a small question had been planted, a vague feeling that this man seemed to know more about her than he allowed to show, and that behind his quiet concern, there might be a story she had not yet been told. One afternoon, while Delphine was busily preparing for the evening rush in the kitchen, a woman walked into the restaurant with a presence that made every pair of eyes turn, and that was the first time she met Bianca Reyes. The woman was a little over 30, tall and sharp in a perfectly tailored white suit, her black hair neatly tied back to reveal a beautiful cold face with a smile calculated down to the slightest curve, and the way she moved through the restaurant, as if every place she stepped into already belonged to her, made people understand at once that she was no ordinary guest. Bianca was the chief executive of a powerful restaurant corporation, an empire growing larger by swallowing smaller restaurant chains, and for a long time she had set her ambition on Castellano's respectable restaurant group. The clean business Sullivan was using to build a different name for his family. She knew Sullivan would never easily sell the cleanest part of his legacy, and so she came to probe, to search for cracks, and the first person she deliberately chose to approach was the new kitchen manager she had heard was breathing fresh life into this restaurant. Bianca asked to meet Delphine, and when Delphine came out from the kitchen, with a little flower still clinging to her apron, Bianca welcomed her with her brightest smile and praise that flowed like water, complimenting Delphine's cooking, praising the way she had turned this restaurant into a place people were talking about, even praising the refined taste and gifted hands that, according to her, were rare in the industry. Delphine, who was not used to being flattered, only thanked her modestly and kept a properly polite manner, but from the very first moment, an instinct might sharpened by too many betrayals, quietly raised a fence of caution inside her, because she noticed that this woman's smile was beautiful but did not reach her eyes, and those sweet words of praise poured out too smoothly to be sincere. Bianca invited her to sit at a table, ordered her a cup of coffee, and in a warm voice as though the two women had known each other for years, she began speaking about opportunities. She said that a talent like Delphine should not be buried in someone else's kitchen, that her corporation was always looking for outstanding chefs, and was prepared to offer several times her current salary, along with the title of executive chef for an entire restaurant chain. She painted before Delphine a glittering future, a proper home for mother and daughter, the best schools for her little girl, a life no longer spent worrying over every dollar. And she spoke of all those things with a perfectly performed sincerity that might have swept another woman away. But Delphine only smiled softly, her hands folded together on the table, and thanked Bianca for the generous offer, then said in a gentle but firm voice that she truly appreciated it, but she was satisfied with her current work and had no intention of changing jobs. Bianca's smile stiffened for one very brief moment before being adjusted back into perfection, and she pressed further, her voice still sweet, saying Delphine should think carefully, that loyalty to people like the Castellano family was not always properly rewarded, and that in this world, a wise woman always knew to place her child's future above vague sentimental obligations. That sentence, spoken with a pleasant smile, carried within it an implication that made Delphine understand this woman knew much more about her situation than she had thought, and that the generous offer was not simply a matter of recruitment. She kept her composure, stood and politely said she needed to return to work, thanked Bianca once more, but firmly left no opening for any promise. After Delphine returned to the kitchen, Bianca remained at that table for a while longer, her slender fingers tapping lightly against the tabletop, her gaze following the woman who had just refused her with a cold attentiveness, because she was not used to rejection. And inside that ambitious woman's mind, a thought had begun to take shape, that if this stubborn kitchen manager refused to become her ally, then perhaps she would have to find another way to turn her into a tool, or into an obstacle that needed to be removed. Bianca was not the kind of woman who easily gave up after being refused once, and in the days that followed, she returned to the restaurant several more times with offers that grew more tempting, salary figures that climbed higher and higher, and even small, tasteful gifts sent to Posey as a clever way of slipping into the mother's heart. But each time, Delphine politely and firmly declined, and on the final occasion, when Bianca lowered her voice and said plainly that she needed Delphine not only for her cooking talent, but also for what she knew about the inner workings of the Castellano restaurant chain, Delphine finally understood the true nature of that invitation. She looked straight into the eyes of the woman across from her and said in a calm voice that could not hide its sharpness that she was a cook, not a piece of merchandise to be bought and sold, that her loyalty did not belong to whoever offered the highest price but to the place that had treated her like a human being, and that she would never betray the people who had given her and her daughter a chance, when the whole world had turned its back. Hearing that, the friendly mask Bianca had worked so hard to preserve finally cracked. The smile vanished completely from her lips. Her beautiful eyes turned cold as ice, and in a voice stripped of every trace of false sweetness, she said Delphine was making a mistake she would regret, that in this world, people who chose to stand in someone else's way usually did not come to a good end. Then she rose, straightened the front of her jacket, and walked out with threatening steps. Word reached Sullivan not long after, and he summoned Bianca to a meeting in the corporation's conference room, because he understood that this woman would not stop unless she was told directly to her face. In the large conference room with a glass wall overlooking the city, Bianca sat across from Sullivan with her usual confidence, presenting a generous acquisition offer, trying to persuade him that selling the restaurant chain to her corporation was a wise business move, and she did not forget to drop a veiled remark that perhaps he was allowing personal concerns, meaning Delphine, to cloud his business judgment. Sullivan sat in silence and listened from beginning to end, his face without the slightest expression. And when Bianca finished speaking, he slowly placed both hands on the table, looked directly at her with gray-blue eyes, so cold they seemed to lower the temperature of the room, and said in a deep, firm voice that she had wasted both their time. He said there were things in this world that did not belong on any list of things for sale, and to him, his restaurant was one of them. Then he paused for a beat, his gaze sharpening by another degree, and added that he would not sell his restaurant, and he would never sell the people who belonged to it. That sentence, brief but heavy as a stone, made Bianca's face go pale, because she understood very clearly that he was not speaking only about business, but publicly standing up to protect the woman she had just tried to lure away and threaten. She left the conference room with her humiliation hidden beneath a strained smile. But inside that ambitious woman, this public rejection had turned into a low burning flame of hatred, and she swore she would not stop until she had what she wanted, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, at the mansion, a small matter began to trouble Delphine. She noticed a new servant in the house, a quiet man with eyes that often slid away, someone who frequently appeared in places where he had no reason to be, and more than once she caught him lingering near the study, or silently watching her from a distance with an expression she could not understand. It awakened her wary instincts again and made her secretly suspect that perhaps this man was someone's planted eyes and ears, sent to observe her. She had no idea that she was looking in the wrong direction, that the suspicious servant was in fact quietly watching over her not to harm her, but to protect her under Rosalind's discreet instruction. Because Rosalind worried about the safety of mother and daughter more than Delphine realized. The truly dangerous one, the one quietly memorizing every conversation and every figure in the family's ledgers, was hiding behind a composed face and a courteous smile no one thought to guard against. And while Delphine reassured herself that perhaps she was only worrying too much, somewhere in the city's darkness, invisible threads had already begun to draw themselves around her life, so that before long everything she had, the fragile piece she had only just touched, would be tested in a way crueler than anything she had ever endured. Not long after the humiliating meeting in the conference room, Bianca began to act in the quiet, poisonous way of someone accustomed to using public opinion as a weapon, and within only a few days, vague articles began appearing on tabloid news sites, pieces that posed questions that seemed accidental but were full of insinuation, asking why a reputable corporation would so firmly refuse such a profitable merger, asking whether perhaps the Castellano family had something to hide behind the dazzling surface of that respectable restaurant chain. The hints spread as quickly as flame through dry straw, and before long the family name was being discussed. Curious and probing eyes began turning toward the restaurant where Delphine worked, and she, though not the direct target named in any of the articles, still felt the weight of that attention pressing down on her shoulders each time she passed through the crowd of whispering diners. There were nosy people who tried to question her about the relationship between her and the owner, and there were scrutinizing looks that measured her from head to toe as if trying to discover why an ordinary woman like her had drawn the attention of such a powerful man. But Delphine did not argue with anyone. She only quietly did her work well, kept her back straight and her gaze calm, because she had learned long ago that the best answer to slander was not to quarrel, but to live in such a way that those words became meaningless. Yet inside, during the late nights when Posey had fallen deeply asleep, that torment gnawed at her again. She wondered whether she was being selfish by letting her daughter grow up near the edge of a world filled with danger and watchful eyes, whether the tender feeling just beginning to bloom in her heart for Sullivan was worth trading away the fragile peace her child had only barely found, and those questions kept returning with no answer, leaving behind an unease that grew larger every day. Then, just as her heart was already heavy with those worries, one evening her phone rang from an unknown number, and when she answered, there was only a silence on the other end long enough to make the back of her neck go cold before the call was cut off, something that repeated several more times in the days that followed, like an invisible shadow drifting around the edges of her life. And that shadow finally revealed itself one afternoon, when Delphine had just stepped out of the restaurant after her shift, and a man separated himself from the crowd to block her path, a face that, though time had carved it with harsher and more ruined lines, she recognized at once. It was Grant, the former husband who had vanished without a trace years ago, after pushing her and her mother into misery. Delphine stood frozen, an entire painful past rushing back in a single instant, and for one moment she thought he had returned to repent, to offer the apology she had deserved to hear for so long. But she was wrong, because there was not the slightest remorse on Grant's face, only the calculating, greedy look of a man who had caught the scent of money. He gave a thin smile and said in that falsely sweet voice that he had heard she had changed her life now, that she was involved with one of the richest men in the region, and that since the two of them had once been married after all, he thought he had a right to share in a piece of her good fortune. Delphine looked at him with cold disgust and said plainly that there was nothing left for the two of them to say, that he had forfeited every right to call himself anything to her from the day he walked away. But Grant only shrugged and let fall a darkly suggestive remark that she should know better and cooperate, because there were people willing to pay him well to learn every hidden corner of her past, and he, on the other hand, had nothing left to lose. That careless sentence revealed to Delphine a chilling truth, that Grant's return was not a coincidence, but had happened because someone had deliberately dug into her past, found her debt-ridden former husband in some forgotten corner, and bought him, turning him into a pawn, meant to pry open every secret and weakness she had. And though Grant did not speak the name aloud, Delphine, with the sharp instinct of someone who had recently endured those honeyed threats, could faintly guess whose hand was pulling the strings behind him, a white-gloved hand with a cold smile and promises of business deals, and she understood that the battle she had never wanted to join had now found its way to her very doorstep, bringing with it the ghosts from a past she had thought were buried forever. What Delphine had only vaguely guessed was merely the visible edge of a plot woven far more carefully than she imagined, because while she was still shaken by Grant's return, in a private place somewhere in the city, Bianca was sitting across from a man with a composed face and a courteous smile. And that man was Rourke, the one who had been hiding for so long beneath the Castellano roof. That ambitious woman had understood early on that if she wanted to bring Sullivan down, she could not attack the wall of his power head-on, but had to slip in from within. And Rourke, a relative who had always felt overlooked by the family, despite holding the most important ledgers in his hands, was precisely the weak link she needed. With promises of money and a more deserved position in the new empire she would build after the takeover, Bianca had bought the greed and quiet resentment simmering inside Rourke, turning him into a knife hidden up her sleeve. And now the two of them were planning together to remove the greatest obstacle in their way, the woman Sullivan was protecting with all his strength. The cruelty of their plan lay in the fact that it did not aim at Delphine's life or honor through violence, but through the very thing Sullivan's world valued above all else, trust and loyalty where money was concerned. Rourke, with unrestricted access to the family vaults and accounts, had quietly withdrawn a large sum from the operating fund of the restaurant chain, an amount large enough to shake anyone who discovered the shortage, then skillfully forged ledger pages and transaction lines so that every trace pointed in only one direction. He had someone secretly place fabricated documents inside Delphine's personal locker at the restaurant, a notebook filled with suspicious figures and handwriting made to closely resemble hers, along with a cheap phone containing a string of fake messages exchanged with an anonymous account about moving money, all arranged with such precision that anyone who found them would believe the kitchen manager had been secretly embezzling funds and funneling them to a rival. It was a perfect trap, a trap designed not only to get Delphine fired, but also to destroy completely the trust Sullivan had placed in her, to push her out of his world under suspicion and disgust, and to ensure that in the underworld where money and loyalty were placed above even life itself, the stain of embezzlement and betrayal would keep her from ever holding her head up again. But fate, as it often does in the most important moments, had placed within that seemingly perfect plan one small gap no one had foreseen. On the night when one of Rourke's men slipped into the staff area of the restaurant to plant the forged documents in Delphine's locker, it happened that Delphine herself returned to the restaurant later than usual because she had forgotten her mother's handkerchief, the one thing she never allowed herself to lose. From behind the crack of the dark kitchen door, Delphine caught sight of a shadowy figure stealthily opening her locker and putting something inside, and with the self-protective reflex that had sunk deep into her blood after everything she had endured in the past, she quietly took out her phone and recorded the whole scene, her hands trembling but holding the device steady, clearly capturing the stranger's face and actions without making a single sound. She could not yet understand the full meaning of what she had just witnessed, did not know it was part of an entire conspiracy tightening around her, and in that moment, she only felt a vague unease and a premonition that something very bad was about to happen. She quietly left before the man discovered her, clutching the phone to her chest as if holding a heavy secret, and following the habit that had saved her from being crushed so many times in her life. She immediately backed up the video to another safe place, not because she already understood that she would need it, but only because the instinct of someone who had been betrayed had taught her that evidence was the one thing that never lied, and that someday, when no one believed her words anymore, these silent images would be the very thing that spoke up to protect her. The trap that had been laid sprang shut only a few days later, and it closed in a way more public and cruel than anything Delphine could have foreseen. One evening, just as she had finished her shift and was cleaning up the kitchen, Rourke appeared unexpectedly with several of the family's men, their faces grave, and with them came Margaret Castellano, the woman everyone in the house called Aunt Meg, Sullivan's aunt, a woman of about 60 with a stern face and eyes sharp as knives, the one who held the financial keys of the entire clan, and had never bothered to hide her suspicion toward Delphine's presence in the house. In a cold voice, Rourke announced that a large sum of money had disappeared from the restaurant's operating fund, and that the audit had led every suspicion toward the kitchen manager. In front of everyone, Delphine's personal locker was opened, and from inside it, the forged materials were pulled out like undeniable evidence. the notebook filled with suspicious numbers, the phone containing fake messages, everything displayed before their eyes like a sentence already written. Aunt Meg took those things, turned through page after page with her brows tightly drawn, and when she lifted her eyes to Delphine, they were filled with the disappointment and fury of someone who believed she had been right from the very beginning. In a severe voice, she said she had always warned them about allowing an outsider with an unclear background to step too deeply into the family, that she had suspected from early on that behind that honest appearance was someone simply waiting for the chance to take advantage. Delphine stood frozen in the circle of accusing eyes, her whole body trembling, and she tried desperately to defend herself, saying she had not done any of those things, that she had been framed, but her voice sank beneath everyone's coldness, and she painfully realized that the words of a poor woman with no standing carried no weight at all when placed against evidence arranged with such precision. There was only one person in that room who stood on her side, and that was Rosalind, who quietly stepped forward, placed a hand on Delphine's shoulder, and declared with a voice full of authority that she did not believe, not for 1 second, that this girl could have done such a thing, because she had seen her heart on that rainy night without needing any proof. And the instinct of a woman who had lived long and seen much told her that something here was wrong. But even Rosalind's voice was not enough to disperse the atmosphere of suspicion closing in around them. And in that moment, Sullivan walked in. He had heard everything, and what hurt Delphine most, what made her heart feel as if it had shattered, was that he did not speak up to protect her as she had secretly hoped. His face was cold and unreadable, and he only looked at her for a long time before saying in a low, distant voice that perhaps it would be best if she left. Delphine heard those words like a merciless sentence. She thought the man she had begun to trust, the man she had allowed into her heart, had finally turned his back on her just like everyone else. And she had no idea that behind that coldness was a painful calculation of his own. Because the moment Sullivan saw that the trap had been laid so perfectly, he immediately understood that a traitor was hiding inside the heart of the family, a poisonous snake moving among the people he trusted most. And he understood that as long as that person had not been dragged into the light, keeping Delphine beneath this roof would be no different from leaving her as the target for the next attacks that would only be more vicious. He deliberately pushed her away to protect her, to move her out of sight while he quietly investigated, and that very night, he secretly assigned the people he trusted most to guard mother and daughter from a distance, an arrangement he could not reveal to anyone, not even to Delphine herself, because even the smallest misstep would be enough to alert the informant. But Delphine could not possibly know any of that, and with a broken heart, she quietly removed her apron, gathered her few small belongings, then returned to the mansion, lifted her bewildered daughter into her arms, and walked out through the iron gate into the night, with tears rolling down her cheeks, carrying both the weight of injustice and the deepest feeling of abandonment. She kept walking through the darkness, holding her child tightly against her, never noticing that behind her, among the long shadows cast by the streetlights beneath the trees, a figure quietly separated from the dark and followed each step she took. A shadow she could not know belonged to someone sent to harm her or someone sent to protect her. In the days after leaving the mansion, Delphine returned to the old basement apartment with a heart weighed down, trying to gather the broken pieces of her life, and telling herself that at least she still had her daughter, still had her hands to begin again, as she had done so many times before. But what she did not know was that the video she had accidentally recorded that night at the restaurant had become a deadly threat to the people behind the plot. Because when Rourke discovered there was a chance someone had witnessed his man planting the trap, he immediately told Bianca, and that ambitious woman, who was not accustomed to leaving behind any loose thread that might turn back and tear into her, coldly ordered that the evidence be taken back and that the troublesome woman be made incapable of causing further harm. One evening, Delphine left Posey with a kind neighbor she trusted, an older woman who often helped watch the little girl, because she needed to go out to take care of a few things and look for a new job, and she kissed her daughter's forehead, told her to be good, then finally stepped out alone into the street, already lit for the night. She had walked some distance when a car with no license plate suddenly rolled up. pulling close to the curb right in front of her. And before she could understand what was happening, two strange men stepped out and blocked her path, their cold faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. Delphine's heart pounded wildly, every instinct in her screaming that something very dangerous was rushing toward her. And when one of the men came closer and demanded that she hand over her phone, she finally realized they had come because of what she had accidentally witnessed. She tried to break free and run, but they seized her, and in the struggle, the phone in her hand was ripped away, one man quickly smashing it beneath his foot while the other tightened his grip on her arm. In that terrifying moment, the only thing filling Delphine's mind was not fear for herself, but the image of Posey's small face. She thought of her daughter sitting at the neighbor's house waiting for her mother. Thought that if she did not return tonight, what would become of the child? Who would sing her to sleep? Who would place her grandmother's handkerchief on her forehead? And that thought lit inside her the fierce strength of a mother. She told herself she had to live, that no matter the cost, she had to live and return to her child. She screamed for help and fought back more fiercely than ever. But how could the strength of one small woman be enough against two men? And just when everything seemed most hopeless, when she felt her legs beginning to give way beneath her, other shadows rushed out from the darkness of the street with the speed of storms. They were the men Sullivan had secretly assigned to protect her from a distance throughout the past few days, and they appeared in time at the very edge between life and death, charging in to stop the two attackers with the decisiveness and skill of people used to facing danger. A brief struggle broke out in the darkness, the sounds of feet shoving against the pavement and shouted commands cutting through the air. And when the two strangers realized their plan had been exposed and they were outnumbered, they hastily released Delphine, jumped back into their car, and sped away until they vanished into the night, leaving the street suddenly quiet again. Delphine collapsed onto the sidewalk, her whole body trembling as she gasped for breath, and one of the men who had just saved her, a man she faintly recognized as one of Sullivan's people, hurried to help her up, gently asking whether she was hurt anywhere and reassuring her that she was safe now. It was in that moment, while the shock had not yet faded, that Delphine slowly began to understand a truth that made her throat tighten, that throughout the days, when she had bitterly believed Sullivan had abandoned her, he had in fact never taken his eyes off her for even a second, that these people had quietly watched over and protected mother and daughter, even while she had blamed him through her tears, and that perhaps the coldness that had pushed her away that night had not been betrayal, but a form of protection she had not been calm enough to recognize. Sullivan's men took Delphine to a safe place that very night, and the first thing she did once she recovered enough to think clearly was insist on picking up her daughter, because all through the ride, the image of Posey sitting and waiting for her mother had haunted her without letting go. When she was finally able to hold her child in her arms, seeing the little girl unharmed and sleeping peacefully in the kind neighbor's embrace, completely unaware of the danger that had just brushed past her mother's life, Delphine broke down crying, the tears of a mother who had just returned from the edge of death. She held her child tightly, pressed her cheek to her daughter's soft hair, and whispered that Mommy was back. Mommy had come back to you now. It was only while holding her child and letting the shock settle that Delphine finally had time to think carefully about what had just happened, and she gradually realized that the phone those men had risked so much to snatch away and smash beneath their feet was actually of little value to them, because the video she had recorded on that fateful night at the restaurant had never remained only inside that device. The habit she had formed during the bitterest years of her life, the self-protective reflex, that the pain of losing her mother and Grant's betrayal had carved deep into her, the habit of always backing up anything important to another safe place as soon as she could, had once again saved her at the very moment she needed it most. On the very night she witnessed the stranger planting the trap, she had quietly uploaded that video to a private storage space only she could access, and so the destroyed phone was nothing more than an empty shell, while the real evidence remained intact beyond the reach of those who believed they had silenced her. More ironically still, the reckless act of sending men to ambush her in the street had become Bianca's fatal mistake, because in her haste to cut off the loose end, she had accidentally left behind new traces. The car without license plates remembered by Sullivan's men, the attackers identified, and all those threads, once followed, led back to the same place, back to the woman who had believed herself too clever for anyone to touch. Delphine understood that the piece she now held in her hand was no longer a meaningless secret, but the key that could overturn the entire game, and for the first time after many days drowning in hurt and despair, a fragile spark of hope began to glow inside her. When news of the attack reached Sullivan, people said he had gone silent for a very long time, and those who witnessed it said they had never seen his stone-cold face reveal so much emotion. He came to see Delphine as soon as he knew she was safe, and when he stepped into the room where she was sitting with her child in her arms, his usual, calm authority seemed to have cracked. He stood there looking at her for a long while, as if needing to make certain that she was still whole before his eyes. Then, in a hoarse voice unlike any she had ever heard from him, he said that when he learned she was in danger, he had felt a fear he had believed. For many years he was no longer capable of feeling. He confessed that all his life he had built walls around his heart so he would never have to suffer the pain of losing someone again. But in the moment he thought he might lose her forever. Those walls had collapsed, and he realized that she had become something he could not bear to live without. Delphine looked up at the powerful man standing before her, with that rare vulnerability laid bare in his gray-blue eyes, and she understood how difficult those words must have been for a man like him to speak. She also confessed how deeply it had hurt her to think he had turned his back on her, and now that she knew the truth, her heart felt both relieved and sorrowful. Those two people, a mother who had been trampled by life, and a boss who had once been betrayed by his own blood, stood facing each other in the quiet room, and between them, without the need for another word, a deep understanding had taken shape. But both of them knew the battle was not over, that the people behind the darkness were still there, and that to win justice for Delphine as well as protect everything they cherished, they would still have to face one final fight whose outcome had not yet been decided. A few days after escaping the attack, when Delphine had returned to the old basement apartment and was trying to keep life as normal as possible for mother and daughter while waiting for everything to come to light, there came a knock at the door one afternoon, and when she opened it, the person standing before her left her stunned. It was Aunt Meg, Sullivan's stern aunt, the woman who had stood there and condemned her on that fateful night. Aunt Meg stepped into the cramped, damp room with the bearing of someone used to living among velvet and silk, her sharp eyes sweeping across the stained walls and worn old furniture. But she said nothing about that miserable place. She only quietly placed a check on the small table, then pushed it toward Delphine. In a cold, blunt voice, she said that the check was for $250,000. Enough money for a woman like her to begin again somewhere far away, enough to secure a proper future for her daughter, and all she had to do to receive it was disappear from Sullivan's life and never return. Delphine looked down at the check, at a number larger than anything she had ever dared dream of, a number that could end every grinding worry that had followed her all her life, and for one moment, her hands trembled slightly, because she was a mother, and the thought of a warm home, of full meals and the best medicines for her child, was a temptation any mother would have struggled to refuse. She looked toward the corner of the room, where Posy was sleeping deeply in a child's dream, one tiny hand still loosely holding her grandmother's handkerchief, and Delphine stood motionless for a long time, torn between what that check could give her child and what she believed was right. But then, after a long silence, Delphine picked up the check with hands that no longer trembled, and instead of putting it away, she gently placed it back before Aunt Meg, pushing it toward her with a calm and decisive gesture. In a soft but steady voice, she said she thanked her for thinking of her daughter's future, but she could not accept this money, because if she accepted it and left, then she would be teaching her daughter that people could be bought and sold, that a person's dignity was something that could be exchanged for money, and that was the last lesson in the world she wanted her child to learn from her mother. She said she wanted her daughter to grow up, knowing that no matter how poor her mother had been, she had never lost herself, that there were things more precious than a comfortable home, and one of them was the right to lift her head and look into her child's eyes without shame. Aunt Meg sat in silence and listened to those words, and strangely, her severe face, always so cold as ice, slowly changed, the lines softening, her sharp eyes suddenly shining in a way Delphine could not understand. And then, to Delphine's astonishment, that powerful woman gave a faint smile, a smile both sorrowful and relieved. She slowly took back the check, folded it and slipped it into her pocket, then said in a voice that had softened a great deal that Delphine had just passed a test no woman who had ever stepped into this family's life had passed before. She confessed that many years earlier, she had watched someone dear to her be destroyed by a clever fortune hunter who pretended to love only to seize wealth and then leave behind ruin and bitterness. And from that day on, she had taken on the role of a cold guard, testing any woman who came near the men of the family, with a check exactly like this one, and until today, every single one of them had taken the money and left. Delphine was the first to give it back, and the tears rolling down that stern woman's cheeks were not tears of defeat, but of a deep release, because at last, after all those years of suspicion and vigilance, she had found a woman whose heart was true, a woman worthy of the nephew she loved. And she took Delphine's calloused hands in her own, held them tightly, and whispered that she was sorry for having wrongfully suspected her, and that from this moment on, Delphine would no longer have to fight alone, while Aunt Meg gradually became an unexpected ally to Delphine. Elsewhere, Sullivan had quietly set in motion a meticulous and merciless investigation to drag into the light whoever had laid the trap for the woman he loved. He was patient and cold when he needed to be, and this time he did not allow emotion to govern him, but quietly had his people review every link in the entire chain of events, from the security camera footage around the restaurant on the nights before the trap sprang shut, to the statements of every employee, every gatekeeper, every person who had been present in the building during the suspicious hours. The most important piece came from Delphine herself. When she gave him the video she had wisely backed up and kept safe, which clearly showed a shadowy figure secretly placing the fabricated documents inside her locker, and although the face of the man who directly carried it out had been carefully hidden, that clue became the first thread Sullivan could follow backward into an entire tangled knot. He had the video compared against the entry and exit schedules of everyone in the house, had the streams of money that had quietly flowed out of the family fund traced, and step by step, the lifeless numbers on paper began to tell a story no lie could cover. The further Sullivan followed the trail of the money that had been withdrawn, the more he saw that the path led back to a place he had never imagined. A place right inside the heart of the family, and when the truth finally appeared before his eyes, it made even a man of iron like him fall silent with pain. The informant was not the quiet servant with evasive eyes, whom Delphine had once secretly suspected, because it turned out that the man had only been silently carrying out the task of protecting mother and daughter under Rosalind's discreet instruction, a truth that gave Sullivan a flicker of relief amid his fury. The true traitor, the one who had sold out the family and laid the trap to harm Delphine, was Rourke, the relative Sullivan had trusted with the care of the most important ledgers and financial secrets, the man who bowed to him every day with a courteous smile and a composed face without the slightest ripple. That truth struck Sullivan like a fatal blow, not because it made no sense, but because it touched the deepest wound in his soul, the wound from that childhood night when he had watched his father betrayed by his own blood. And now history seemed to be repeating itself with cruel precision, because once again the person stabbing him in the back was someone of the same blood. Someone he had placed his trust in, for the simple reason that family did not betray family. A deeper investigation also revealed that Rourke had not acted alone, and that behind him was the hand of Bianca, the ambitious woman who had skillfully exploited Rourke's quiet resentment and greed to turn him into a knife hidden inside the house, in exchange for promises of money and power in the empire she dreamed of building once she had swallowed the Castellano legacy. And when Sullivan had his people follow the clues tied to Delphine's past as well, he discovered that Bianca was also the one who had dug into her background, tracked down Grant, the debt-ridden former husband, and bought him as another pawn to pry open Delphine's secrets and weaknesses, using the very ghost of her past as one more weapon against her. Thus, two threads that had seemed separate, one slipping into the heart of the family through Rourke to stalk Sullivan, and the other reopening an old wound through Grant to corner Delphine, were finally pulled back to the same white-gloved hand, the same cold smile that had once sat in the conference room painting glittering visions. When every piece had locked into place and formed a complete picture, Sullivan sat silently in his study for a very long time, his face no longer showing pain but having returned to its terrifying coldness, though this time a flame of determination burned in those gray-blue eyes, because he knew the moment had come to pull everyone hiding in the darkness out into the light, and he began preparing for one final confrontation, a confrontation in which he would not only claim justice for the woman he loved, but also close the cycle of betrayal that had haunted his entire life. The final day of judgment came during a gathering of the entire family in the mansion's great hall, where Sullivan had invited all those closest to him, as well as Bianca, under the pretense of discussing the deal once more, causing that ambitious woman to enter with her usual confidence, never knowing she was walking straight into a trap set by the very man she had meant to bring down. Once everyone was seated, Sullivan slowly rose, and in a voice as deep and cold as steel, he began peeling back each layer of the entire conspiracy. He had Delphine's backed-up video played, had the money withdrawn from the family fund matched against the records, had the statements and evidence gathered by the investigation read aloud, and each piece of truth fell like a hammer blow, making Bianca's confident face slowly turn pale. Then he turned toward Rourke, who was still trying to preserve his false composure, and exposed his role as the knife hidden inside the house. The man who had sold out his own blood, while also having Grant brought forward to confront them. The man who lowered his head and confessed that he had been hired to dig into Delphine's past. When the last of the threads had all been drawn back to one source, when there was no longer any room for denial, Bianca sprang to her feet and tried to protest loudly. But before the mounting evidence, her voice broke, and the perfect mask she had guarded for so long finally shattered. In desperation, the once arrogant woman turned toward Sullivan, her voice suddenly shifting into pleading, saying that everything she had done was only because she wanted the place she deserved beside him, that if he had agreed to join hands with her, the two of them could have built an empire no one could rival. And she begged him to give her one chance. Sullivan only looked at her with eyes cold and unmoving, and answered with a brief sentence sharp as a blade, saying she had never loved him, that what she craved was power, and a person who knew only how to hunger for power could never understand the worth of things that could not be bought with it. He gave a signal, and the conspirators were taken away one after another to face the punishment of the law. Bianca for orchestrating the scheme and attempting harm, Rourke for betrayal and embezzlement, all led away under the silent witness of the entire family, closing a chapter filled with dark calculation. But while everyone was still stunned by the truths that had just been revealed, something more unexpected than everything that had happened came next. When Rosalind slowly rose and walked to Delphine's side, holding in her hand a small object she had treasured for many years. She looked at the young woman with tear-filled eyes and an indescribably tender smile, then began telling a story more than half a lifetime old, about the long-ago days when she had been a young girl with nothing, desperate and cornered, faint with hunger in a where no one cared to look at her, and about a strange woman who had stopped beside her, a poor woman with a warm heart who had shared a loaf of bread and a place to shelter when Rosalind had nothing left, without asking questions or demanding anything in return. She said that unconditional kindness had saved her, had given her the faith to stand up and keep going, and she had promised herself that one day she would find her benefactor again and repay her. But the currents of life had carried her away from that woman's trail, and she had carried that debt of gratitude through her entire life with an ache that never eased. Then, as the hall fell quiet, little Posy ran to her mother's side, holding the worn linen handkerchief she always kept close, and from its folds, a small object slipped out and rolled across the marble floor. Sullivan picked it up, his eyes widening as he handed it to his mother. It was the original, heavily tarnished silver hawk button. Delphine gently took the button she had found in her apron from her pocket and held it out, while Rosalind trembled as she produced her own matching token. They matched flawlessly, two pieces of the exact same legacy. Rosalind looked at Delphine with tear-filled eyes, realizing the truth. She explained that decades ago, when she was a helpless girl, a kind woman had shared a loaf of bread and sheltered her from the cold, and Rosalind had given her that very button as a sacred vow to return the favor one day. Tears streamed down Delphine's face, as Rosalind took her hand and whispered that the legendary savior she had been searching for all her life was none other than Delphine's late mother. The kindness Delphine gave on that rainy afternoon was not a random coincidence, but the beautiful continuation of a noble heart passed down through 2 generations. In that moment, in the great hall that had just witnessed the fall of evil, everyone fell silent before a truth so beautiful it made the heart ache, that the loaf of bread a poor mother had given away in the past had returned in the shape of an entire home for her daughter, and that sometimes the seeds of kindness, though planted in silence, could still bloom into miracles after a whole lifetime. In the days after the truth was exposed and evil was brought into the light, a strangely warm atmosphere gradually returned beneath the Castellano roof, as if the entire mansion, which had been cold for so long, was finally being warmed by the presence of Delphine and her daughter. Aunt Meg, the stern woman who had once stood in judgment of her, had now changed completely, and one morning, in front of the whole family, she took the initiative to approach Delphine and said in a rarely sincere voice that she owed her a public apology, that she had looked at her with cruel suspicion and had nearly pushed an honest woman out of the lives of the people she loved. She took Delphine's hand and said that from now on, she was part of this family, not as a guest being tolerated, but as a daughter being welcomed, and Delphine, who had grown far too used to contemptuous stares and doors slamming shut, received that sincerity with tears in her eyes, as if it were a gift she had never dared dream of. Rosalind was more radiant than ever. The burden of the debt of gratitude she had carried for a lifetime finally lifted from her shoulders, and she stayed close to Delphine and little Posy, as if trying to make up for all the years she had lost track of her benefactor's family. She told Posy old stories, taught the child how to make little cakes, and the child's clear laughter rang through rooms that for far too long had known only silence. Posy, now healthy and rosy thanks to careful care, had come to regard this place entirely as home, and she became especially attached to someone no one had expected, Sullivan himself. The man whose name had once made an entire region hold its breath was now often pulled by the hand by a 5-year-old girl, demanding that he play with her, and the strange thing was that he never refused. He patiently sat for hours on the floor with the child, listening to her endless, wandering stories, and in the innocent presence of that little girl, the sharp, cold edges inside him seemed to soften. One afternoon, while Sullivan was sitting in the study reading, Posy ran in with a sheet of paper in her hand, her eyes shining brightly with excitement. She climbed onto the chair beside him and proudly told him she had just finished drawing a picture of her family. Sullivan set the book down and lowered his eyes to the drawing made in the clumsy colored strokes of a child. On it was a house with smoke curling from its chimney in twisting rings, and in front of it stood 4 figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. The little girl pointed to each figure and introduced them. "This is Mommy with brown hair. This is me. This is Grandma Rosalind with silver hair." And then she stopped at the tallest figure standing beside her mother, lifted her face to look at him with the adorable seriousness of a child, and asked in her clear, innocent voice whether he was the one sent to watch over Mommy and her, because she said her mother often told her that good people were always sent at the exact moment someone needed them most, and she was certain he was one of those people. That innocent question, spoken from the small lips of a child, who knew nothing of the schemes and hatred of the adult world, touched a deep place in Sullivan's heart, the very place he had protected for so many years beneath his cold armor, the place that held the loneliness of a boy who had once watched his father be betrayed and had never dared trust anyone again. The man of steel whom no enemy had ever been able to shake, the man an entire region feared, fell silent before a child's drawing, and then, to his own astonishment, his gray-blue eyes, usually as cold as harbor water, suddenly blurred, and a tear slid down the face that seemed to have forgotten long ago how to cry. He reached out and gently stroked the child's soft hair, his voice tightening, and told her that yes, he would always be here to watch over her and her mother, that as long as he was alive, nothing bad would ever be allowed to touch them again. Delphine, standing silently at the doorway and having witnessed the entire moment, could not hold back her tears either, because she understood that her daughter, with the innocence of a clear soul, had done what no one else had been able to do. She had touched and begun to heal the heart of a man the whole world believed had turned to stone. It should have been the beginning of a complete and happy chapter. But in the middle of those warm days, an unease quietly began to grow inside Delphine. An unease that did not come from any danger before her eyes, but from everything she had endured. During sleepless nights, she kept thinking about the road they had just crossed, about the night she had nearly lost her life on that dark street, about the forged evidence, about the people who had used human lives as pieces in their game of power. And she realized that although Bianca and Rourke had been brought before the law, the world that had produced them still remained intact. She understood that as long as Sullivan still stood at the top of that empire, there would always be other Biancas, other Rourkes, other schemes rising from the darkness, and what hurt the mother's heart inside her most was not fear for herself, but the thought that her little girl would have to grow up on the edge of a world where danger could strike at any moment. She had already watched her peace be torn out of her hands once, had already stood at the edge of death once, simply because she had accidentally stepped into a world that did not belong to her, and she wondered whether she had the right to place Posey's future into such a gamble, no matter how deep her feelings for Sullivan had become. And so, one evening, with a heavy heart, Delphine went to Sullivan and honestly spoke all the turmoil inside her. She said she loved him, that the days beside him and beside his mother had been the warmest days she had ever known, but precisely because she was a mother, she could not feel at ease letting her daughter grow up in a world where she would always have to live in fear. And perhaps the best thing for Posey was for mother and daughter to leave and find a quieter life. Sullivan listened silently to every word she said, and instead of feeling wounded or angry, he only remained thoughtful for a very long time, because he understood that her worries were not a rejection of love, but the deepest expression of sacred motherhood, and he knew that empty promises would mean nothing to a woman life, had taught too many lessons about betrayal, so instead of trying to hold her back with words, he chose to answer with action. He told her that he understood her fear, and that she was completely right. A world like his was no place for a child to grow up safely. Then he confessed something he had been quietly carrying inside him ever since mother and daughter stepped into his life, that he was exhausted by this empire built from suspicion and darkness, that the night he had almost lost her made him realize all the power in the world meant nothing if it could not protect the people he loved, and worse, if it pulled them into danger instead. He said he had decided, step by step, to withdraw from the business in the shadows, to transform the family into transparent and honorable enterprises, to use the power and wealth he had to build something clean that could be left to the next generation. And he said he was doing it not only to keep her with him, but because for the first time in his life, he had a reason large enough to change. Delphine looked into the eyes of the man standing before her, and what she saw there was not the rushed commitment of someone afraid of loss, but the calm resolve of a person who had truly seen the road he wanted to take. And her heart, which had become so cautious after so much hurt, was finally and gradually persuaded by that sincerity. In the days that followed, when the love between them had grown steadier, Sullivan suggested buying Auberge Dorée and giving it to her, so she could own the very place that had once treated her so cruelly, but Delphine only smiled and shook her head. She told him in a gentle but firm voice that she did not want to own the place that had once made her feel worthless, that she did not want to build her future on the foundation of a past full of wounds, but wanted to create something entirely new with her own hands, a place that had never known contempt and held only kindness. And Sullivan, looking at the woman he loved as she spoke those words with her eyes shining with faith in the future, gave a soft nod, because he understood that this was exactly what had made her different from the very beginning. 6 months later, on a small sun-filled street in East Boston, a new bakery opened its doors beneath a simple sign bearing the name The Proof, a name that meant both dough fermentation and evidence, because to Delphine, this place was living proof that kindness, once planted, would one day bloom. She had not accepted free money from anyone to build it, only Sullivan's guarantee so she could borrow the funds and repay every dollar herself through her own sweat and labor, because she wanted to keep whole the pride of a person standing firmly on her own feet. And before long, that little bakery became beloved by the entire neighborhood, not only because of its fragrant, delicious pastries, but because of the unusually warm atmosphere that seemed to shine from within it. What made The Proof more special than any other bakery was that every late afternoon, while the end-of-day bread was still warm. Delphine opened the doors wide to welcome the homeless and those whose lives had fallen into hardship, giving them a free meal and a cup of hot chocolate, exactly as she had once done on the rainy afternoon that changed her entire life, because she had never forgotten what it felt like to be faint with hunger and turned away by the whole world. One afternoon, while Delphine was busy in the bakery kitchen, a poorly dressed woman stepped timidly inside, and when Delphine looked up, she recognized her at once. It was Camille, the former manager who had once stolen her tips and fired her so mercilessly. The elegant bakery from those days had gone bankrupt because of poor management and cold human hearts, and Camille had now lost everything, coming here to ask for work, without knowing that the owner of this bakery was the very woman she had once trampled on. When Camille recognized Delphine, her face turned pale with shame, and she stammered as if about to turn and leave. But Delphine called her back in a calm voice, without the slightest resentment. She did not bring up the past, did not speak a single word of blame. She only looked straight into the eyes of the woman who had once made her suffer and said she was willing to hire Camille, but on one condition, that, in this place, no one was ever allowed to look down on anyone who walked through that door, whether they came to buy an elegant cake or only to ask for something to fill an empty stomach, because every human being, rich or poor, deserved to be treated with respect. Hearing those words, Camille could no longer hold herself together and burst into sobs, tears of remorse and gratitude, before a mercy she knew very well she did not deserve, and she lowered her head and gave the apology she should have spoken long ago, while Delphine only gently placed a hand on her shoulder, because she understood that the most beautiful way to punish cruelty was not to plant more hatred, but to give it a chance to become something better. That afternoon, as soft golden sunlight fell, Delphine's small family gathered together inside the warm bakery. Sullivan was now a different man. The cold edges of his face had softened, and his empire was changing day by day toward honest roads. He sat beside Delphine and watched healthy little Posy running around, chattering happily, while Rosalind sat in a comfortable armchair with a cup of hot tea in her hand and a contented smile on her face. Posy ran over and climbed into her lap, and with the innocent curiosity of childhood, the little girl looked up and asked why, long ago, Rosalind had pretended to be a poor, ragged old woman. Rosalind tenderly stroked the child's hair, her eyes distant, as she looked toward the doorway, where the unfortunate were being welcomed with kindness. Then answered in a warm voice that people only truly reveal their hearts when they believe we have nothing to offer them, and is in moments like that, my child, that we find the most precious treasures in the world, treasures that do not lie in gold or silver, but in the human heart. Delphine's story, from a poor single mother trampled by the world to a woman who found a home and a sincere love, stands as proof of a simple yet profound truth, that kindness is never meaningless, that a small act of goodness given without hope of reward can quietly plant seeds that later bloom into miracles, sometimes after an entire generation, and that human dignity is the most precious possession of all, something no amount of money can buy and no hardship can take away unless we surrender it ourselves. Her story also reminds us never to judge a person by appearance or status, because beneath a worn and ragged coat there may be a noble heart, and because compassion, not hatred, is the true strength that can heal and transform, even the hearts that seemed most hardened. If this story has touched your heart, please press the subscribe button for our channel, along with like and share, so you can listen to many more moving and meaningful stories every day. And we would love to know how you felt about Delphine's story. So please leave a comment sharing what you feel from deep within your heart, because every line you share is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for listening until the final moments, and we wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next videos.